The story of a young woman who left her house heading to university and never returned. For 6 years, her family searched for answers in every corner of the city, facing dead ends, false hopes, and the overwhelming silence from authorities. The investigation seemed condemned to oblivion, archived alongside thousands of similar cases. But in 2018, something extraordinary happened. Her younger brother, who was barely 8 years old when she disappeared, now 14, remembered something. A detail so small, so apparently insignificant, that nobody had considered it relevant during the entire investigation. A detail that had remained buried in the mind of a traumatized child, waiting for the precise moment to emerge. What that memory revealed would not only find the missing young woman, but would expose a truth so disturbing it would forever change how her family understood the last 6 years of their lives. Because sometimes the answers we desperately seek are closer than we ever imagined, hidden in the memory fragments of the person we least expect. Before continuing with this shocking story, if you value real cases like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. Now let's discover what really happened. October 11, 2012. Austin, Texas. Rebecca Anderson was 19 years old. She was studying her sophomore year of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She was the type of young woman professors remembered fondly, not because she was the brightest in class, but for her persistence. She was 5'4", slender, with brown hair always pulled back in a ponytail. She wore rectangular framed glasses that she constantly adjusted with her index finger, a nervous gesture she'd developed as a teenager. Since childhood, she'd shown an insatiable curiosity about understanding why people acted the way they did. At 15, she'd already decided she would study psychology. She wanted to help people, especially children who suffered trauma. But Rebecca carried her own invisible burden. Her family didn't know it, but for 2 years she'd been seeing a psychologist privately. She paid for sessions with money earned from tutoring. The reason? Generalized anxiety and panic attacks that had started for no apparent reason. She lived with her parents in the Cedar Park neighborhood, a 2-story house painted terracotta on Maple Street. David Anderson, her father, was 48 years old. He worked as a supervisor at an auto parts factory. Linda Anderson, her mother, was 45. She was a nurse at a medical clinic. She had 2 brothers. Nathan, 12 years old, a middle schooler, extroverted, loud, always with a soccer ball under his arm. And Jacob, the youngest, barely 8 years old, in 3rd grade. He was an observant, quiet child, too quiet for his age. He liked to draw, especially dinosaurs and dragons. He filled entire notebooks with fantastical creatures in impossible colors. He had a eon-eye special connection with Rebecca. She was the only one who really sat down to look at his drawings with attention, asking him about every detail, every color chosen. The family dynamic was, like in many middle-class American homes, a mix of deep love and superficial communication. David worked extended shifts, left home at 5 in the morning, returned after 7 at night, exhausted. Linda divided her time between rotating shifts and keeping the house running. Family meals were increasingly sporadic. Rebecca had classes until late. Nathan had soccer practice. Jacob ate early because he fell asleep at 8. Sundays were sacred. Church at 11, everyone eating together. But even those moments were loaded with uncomfortable silences, each family member lost in their own thoughts. What nobody knew was that during the last year, strange things had started happening in the neighborhood. Unknown cars circulating slowly through residential streets at late hours. Men who weren't from the neighborhood standing on specific corners, apparently waiting for someone. Neighbors talked about it quietly, in lines at the local grocery store, on park benches. Nobody wanted to say out loud what everyone thought. In Austin in 2012, there were things it was better not to talk about. That Thursday, October 11th, dawned overcast. The temperature would hover around 75 degrees during the day. The morning news talked about rising gas prices, the recent presidential election. Nothing about disappearances. There was never anything about disappearances. That Thursday, Rebecca had a normal schedule. Classes from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., then a 2-hour break, finally a seminar from 4 to 6 p.m. Linda had left for her shift at 5:30 a.m. David left shortly after. Nathan was in his usual morning chaos state, looking for his gym uniform, shouting that he couldn't find his cleats. Jacob was eating breakfast in silence, moving his cereal from one side of the bowl to the other without much appetite. Rebecca came downstairs at 7:15 a.m. She wore dark jeans, a light blue blouse, her usual black backpack. Her hair was pulled back in the habitual ponytail. Her glasses reflected the light from the kitchen bulb. David asked from the table if she had eaten breakfast already. Rebecca lied, saying she had eaten something upstairs. Morning anxiety closed her stomach. She rarely actually ate breakfast. He told her to get home before 9, when her mom got off her shift. She said her classes ended at 6, and she would get home around 7:30. He told her to be careful. It was the last conversation they would have for 6 years. Jacob looked up from his cereal when Rebecca approached to say goodbye. She ruffled his hair affectionately. She asked him to promise he would behave in school, calling him Little Dragon. Little Dragon. That's what she'd called him since he was 3 years old. Jacob nodded, then, on impulse, hugged her tight. Tighter than normal. Rebecca asked, surprised, if he was okay. The boy didn't respond, just hugged her a moment longer before letting go. Rebecca left the house at 7:25 a.m. Maple Street was quiet as always at that hour. Some neighbors were pulling their cars out of garages heading to work. The man who sold breakfast tacos on the corner was already setting up his stand. The gray sky promised rain for the afternoon. She walked the 4 blocks to Congress Avenue, where she caught the first bus. The stop was located in front of a convenience store. Mr. Wilson, the owner, a man of nearly 70 with a gray mustache, was sweeping the entrance. He greeted her good morning. She returned the greeting. He warned her about the afternoon rain and told her to take an umbrella. She confirmed she had it. He was the last adult from the neighborhood who saw her. The bus arrived at 7:40, Route 10, blue and white, with a cracked windshield on the driver's side. Rebecca got on, paid her $1.75, sat in her usual seat, 3rd row on the right side by the window. She pulled out her old iPod, put in her earbuds, let the music isolate her from the noise of morning traffic. The ride to the central station took 35 minutes. She got off at 8:15. She had to walk 2 blocks to the stop for the second bus, the one that would take her to campus. While waiting, Rebecca received a text message. The number wasn't saved in her contacts. The message simply said, someone needed to talk to her urgently at the usual coffee shop at 3 p.m. Rebecca frowned, looking at her Nokia screen. Who was texting her? The usual coffee shop. She didn't have a usual coffee shop with anyone. She was about to respond asking who it was when the bus arrived. She put the phone in her backpack pocket and got on. She arrived on campus at 8:45. Her classes proceeded normally. Developmental psychology at 9, neuropsychology at 11. At 1, she ate lunch alone in the small cafeteria in the building, a ham sandwich and orange juice. She checked her phone again. The strange message was still there. She hadn't responded. At 2:15 p.m., instead of going to the library as she usually did, Rebecca did something unexpected. She left campus. University security cameras captured her leaving through the main entrance at 2:19. She carried her backpack, walked hurriedly, checked her phone every few steps. She turned right on the street, and disappeared from the camera's view. That was the last official recorded image of Rebecca Anderson. She didn't return for her 4 o'clock seminar. Professor Patricia Navarro noticed her absence because Rebecca never missed class. She was meticulous about attendance, almost obsessively. But the professor didn't make much of it. Students missed sometimes. It happened. At 6:30 p.m., when Rebecca didn't show up at home, Linda started to worry. She called her cell. It rang several times before going to voicemail. She tried again. Same thing. At 7, Linda was anxious. At 7:30, she was panicking. David arrived home at 8:15. He found Linda hysterical, dialing Rebecca's phone over and over. They called some of her classmates. Nobody had seen her after 2 p.m. At 9 p.m., David and Linda went to the nearest police station. The officer who attended them told them what they tell everyone. The officer told them she probably went off with her boyfriend or some friends to give him 48 hours, that they always came back. Linda, with tears running down her face, begged him to take the report seriously. Linda insisted through tears that her daughter was not like that. She would not do this. Something had happened to her. The officer sighed, pulled out a form, started filling in basic information. The form would join hundreds of others in the state police files. At home, Nathan couldn't sleep. He kept asking where Rebecca was. Linda told him she'd stayed with a friend, a white lie to protect him, at least for that night. Jacob, in his room, heard everything. He heard his mother's sobs through the walls, his father's heavy footsteps going back and forth in the hallway, the whispered words, the desperate phone calls. That night Jacob didn't sleep. He sat on his bed hugging his pillow, with eyes wide open in the darkness. In his 8-year-old mind, he tried to process what was happening. His sister Rebecca hadn't come home, and something in his stomach told him this was different. This was bad. And there was something else. Something his child brain had registered that morning, but that at that moment he didn't know how to express. Something he'd seen. Something small. Something that in 6 years his mind would finally process and understand. But that October night in 2012, while his family crumbled in panic around him, Jacob simply sat in the darkness, hugging his pillow, with a fragment of memory floating just below his consciousness. Waiting. The first 72 hours after the disappearance were a whirlwind of frantic activity. David missed work. Linda took leave from the hospital. Together they walked every corner of the university campus. They posted photographs of Rebecca on light poles, walls, store windows. Missing. Please help. Rebecca Anderson, 19 years old. The photographs showed Rebecca smiling with her characteristic glasses, her ponytail, her hopeful eyes. They posted hundreds of those flyers, thousands, on buses, at stops, in shopping centers, in markets. Nathan accompanied them on weekends carrying stacks of flyers with reddened eyes, not really understanding why his sister didn't appear. Jacob stayed with the grandparents during those days. Grandma Margaret tried to maintain some appearance of normalcy, taking him to school, preparing his favorite meals, letting him draw for hours at the kitchen table. But Jacob had changed. The boy who was already quiet became almost mute. He stopped drawing brightly colored dragons. Now he only made dark strokes, figures without defined shape, using only black and gray pencils. The official investigation was at best mediocre. The agent assigned to the case did the minimum required. He interrogated Rebecca's classmates, superficially reviewed campus security cameras, talked to the family. Everything was documented in a file that grew with papers but not with answers. What people didn't do was investigate the strange text message Rebecca had received that morning. When David mentioned that Rebecca's phone had been left at home, they found it in her backpack that appeared 3 days later abandoned on a park bench. The agent reviewed the messages, saw the text from the unknown number, wrote down the number. Supposedly they would track it. They never did. The backpack had appeared on Sunday, October 14th, found by a man walking his dog. Inside was everything: textbooks, notebooks, Rebecca's cell phone, her wallet with her ID, and $50. The only thing missing was her iPod and her earbuds. Why would someone take only that and leave the money? That question would join many others that would never be answered. As weeks passed without any clues, the family dynamic began to erode. Pain has a particular way of wearing down bonds that once seemed unbreakable. David immersed himself in the search with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He created a Facebook group. He posted daily updates even though there was nothing new to report. He contacted organizations of families of missing persons. He attended marches, sit-ins in front of the police station. He spent the family savings hiring a private investigator, an ex-detective named Paul Mitchell. Mitchell charged $5,000 up front. He worked the case for 3 weeks. Finally, he told David what he didn't want to hear. Without witnesses, without a body, without a ransom demand, this looks bad. Your daughter is probably dead. I'm sorry. David threw him out of his house, shouting that he was wrong, that Rebecca was alive, that she had to be alive. Linda processed the pain differently. She withdrew. She left her job at the hospital after 4 months. Unable to function, unable to concentrate. She spent her days in Rebecca's room, sitting on the bed, smelling her clothes, reading her notebooks, looking for some clue, some indication that her daughter had planned to leave. She found nothing because there was nothing to find. The relationship between David and Linda fractured. There were no shouts, no violent fights, just a cold distancing, a gradual moving apart, each trapped in their own form of pain, unable to reach each other. They stopped sleeping in the same bed. David stayed on the couch, frequently awake until dawn, browsing the internet, searching for stories of missing people who appeared years later. Nathan tried to be strong, tried to be the man of the house when his father was absent. But the burden was too much for a child. His grades fell. He quit the soccer team. He became withdrawn, aggressive at school, getting into fights over anything. But it was Jacob who changed most profoundly. The boy who had been quiet became almost invisible. At school, teachers had to call him several times before he'd respond. During recess, he'd sit alone in a corner of the playground, drawing in a notebook he never showed anyone. At home, he developed obsessive routines. He had to check that all the doors were locked before sleeping. He had to verify that windows were secure. He had to look under his bed and inside his closet every night, without fail. When Linda asked why he did it, Jacob simply said that, so nobody else disappears. The grandparents suggested therapy. Linda tried taking him to a child psychologist. Jacob went to 3 sessions. In each, he sat in silence without saying a word, just drawing on paper the psychologist provided. After the 3rd session, Linda stopped taking him. They didn't have money to continue. What nobody noticed was that Jacob was processing something. Something he'd seen that morning of October 11th. Something his child brain had registered but hadn't known to categorize as important. The human brain is an extraordinary machine. Memories, especially traumatic ones, don't store in the linear way we imagine. They fragment, scatter, and sometimes, especially in children, remain inaccessible until some trigger brings them back to the surface. For Jacob, that trigger was still years away. Meanwhile, life continued as it inevitably does, even in the middle of tragedy. Rebecca's first birthday without her was devastating. August 23, 2013. Linda spent the entire day in bed crying. David left the house and didn't return until dawn. He'd driven aimlessly for hours. Nathan locked himself in his room, earphones in, music at full volume. Jacob baked a small chocolate cake alone in the kitchen. At 9 years old, he followed a recipe he found on the internet, carefully measuring each ingredient. When it was ready, he put on a candle, lit it, and sang "Happy Birthday" with his thin little voice, alone in the kitchen, illuminated by that single candle. He whispered "Happy Birthday" to Becca before blowing out the candle. He didn't eat the cake. He left it on the table all night. In the morning, Linda found it and broke down crying. The years passed with that painful slowness that characterizes unresolved grief. 2013 became 2014, then 2015. Active searches became less frequent. The Facebook group David had created remained active, but posts spaced out from daily to weekly, from weekly to monthly. The Anderson family became one more statistic. One of thousands of American families destroyed by violence, by governmental indifference, by a justice system that didn't work. The media never covered the case. There was nothing newsworthy about it, just another young woman missing in Austin, another destroyed family, another life erased from the map without explanation. In 2016, 4 years after the disappearance, David finally accepted he had to return to work full-time. Savings had run out. They had debts. The house was at risk of foreclosure. Linda tried to return to work too, but couldn't. Her medical leave for depression extended indefinitely. Nathan found escape by staying away from home as much as possible, not because he didn't love his family, but because being in that house was suffocating. And Jacob, who was now 12 years old, remained that silent boy. But something had begun to change in him. Puberty was arriving, bringing with it not only physical changes, but also a new way of processing the world. He began asking questions, not directly about Rebecca, never directly, but questions about memory, about how the brain works, about why sometimes we remember things and sometimes we forget them. His biology teacher noticed his unusual interest in neuroscience. She lent him books. Jacob read them with a veracity that surprised everyone. At 13, he was reading university texts about memory formation, about trauma, about how a child's brain processes stressful events differently. Nobody in his family understood why he was so obsessed. They thought maybe it was his way of connecting with Rebecca, who had studied psychology. And partially it was true. But there was something else. Something Jacob hadn't told anyone. Somewhere deep in his brain was a blurry image, fragmented but persistent. An image from that morning, the morning of October 11th, 2012, when he was 8 years old and Rebecca had left home for the last time. There was something in that image, something he'd seen, something important. But every time he tried to focus on it, the memory slipped out of reach, like trying to grab smoke with your hands. Thus arrived 2017, 5 years since the disappearance. The police had officially archived the case. Not closed, technically, because missing persons cases never officially close in America, but archived, stored in cardboard boxes in some dusty warehouse alongside thousands of other files of people the system had decided weren't worth the effort to keep looking for. David received notification by mail, a cold, bureaucratic letter explaining that given no new evidence had emerged in 5 years, the case was considered inactive, but could be reopened if new information appeared. That night, David cried for the first time since the early days. He cried with great sobs that shook his entire body, sitting on the couch that had been his bed for 5 years, with that letter in his trembling hands. "They forgot her," he repeated between sobs. "Everyone forgot my girl." But he was wrong. There was someone who hadn't forgotten, someone who carried a piece of the puzzle stored in the deepest corners of his mind. Someone whose brain was finally, after years of unconscious processing, preparing to bring that memory to the surface. October 11th, 2018. Exactly 6 years later. Jacob was now 14 years old. Physically, he'd grown considerably, already reaching 5'6" in height. But mentally, he'd matured in a way that went beyond his years. The last 2 years, he'd read voraciously about neuroscience, not just textbooks, but studies, scientific articles. His biology teacher had connected him with a university professor. Jacob had learned about memory, about how a child's brain processes trauma, about how memories can remain buried for years until some specific stimulus brings them back. And he'd begun to suspect he had one of those memories. That morning of October 11th, Jacob woke up early, not because he had to go to school. It was a day off. He woke up because he'd had a dream, one of those vividly realistic dreams. In the dream, he was 8 years old again. He was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. Rebecca was coming downstairs, approaching, ruffling his hair. But then something different from how he remembered it happened. Rebecca left the house and he ran to the living room window to watch her go. From the window, he saw Rebecca walking down Maple Street. But she wasn't alone. There was someone else, someone walking behind her, keeping distance but definitely following her. Jacob woke up startled, heart pounding. Had it been just a dream, or was it a memory? He got up, left his room without making noise, went downstairs slowly, entered the kitchen, the same kitchen from 6 years ago. He sat in the chair that had been his when he was 8. Then he did something he hadn't done in 6 years. He got up and walked to the living room window. From there, you could perfectly see the path Rebecca would have taken. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, let his mind return to that morning. And then the memory emerged complete, clear, as if it had been waiting 6 years to be remembered. He had seen someone else, a car, a dark car, navy blue or black. It was parked on the street ahead of where Rebecca was walking. When Rebecca passed by the car, someone had gotten out. A person. Jacob hadn't been able to see the face clearly. It was too far away and he was very small. But he remembered the silhouette. He remembered the person had started walking in the same direction as Rebecca. Not running, not threateningly, just walking, keeping distance, but definitely following her. His first impulse was to run tell his parents, but he stopped. What if he was wrong? What if it was just a dream? What if he gave his parents false hope? He spent 3 days without telling anyone. During those days, he tried to confirm his memory in other ways. He went to the municipal library. He looked for newspapers from October 2012. He found nothing. He tried talking to Mr. Wilson, the convenience store owner. The man was still there, now 76 years old. "Mr. Wilson, do you remember the morning my sister disappeared?" The old man looked at him with misty eyes. "Of course I remember, son. Your sister passed by like always. She greeted me. Do you remember if there were cars parked on the street that morning?" Mr. Wilson frowned, thinking. "There are parked cars all the time, boy. Why do you ask?" That night, Jacob made a decision. He had to tell his parents. On October 14th, 3 days after the memory resurfaced, Jacob came down for dinner. It was one of those rare occasions when the whole family was together. Jacob waited until they finished eating. Then, with a trembling voice, he said he had to tell them something about Rebecca. The effect was immediate. David stopped chewing. Linda looked up abruptly. Even Nathan put down his phone. And then Jacob told them everything. The dream, the memory that emerged. The person he'd seen getting out of the car and following Rebecca. He showed them his notebook with everything he'd written down. When he finished, David stood up so abruptly, his chair fell backward. He hugged his youngest son with an intensity that almost took his breath away. David whispered that he knew it. Someone had taken her. She had not left on her own. At 8 a.m. the next day, David and Jacob were at the Austin Police Department. They waited 4 hours before being seen. The detective who received them was named Detective Monica Sandoval. She listened with a mix of skepticism and compassion. She responded skeptically that a memory from an 8-year-old child after 6 years was not reliable. Memory did not work that way. David argued that the boy was not traumatized at that moment. It was the morning of the disappearance, before they knew something was wrong. The detective sighed. The detective explained that even if his son saw something, there was no way to verify it now after 6 years. A dark car without plates and a person without clear description was not enough. They left the police station with nothing. In the car, David hit the steering wheel in frustration. Jacob suggested they investigate themselves. His father asked what he meant. Jacob explained that if the authorities were not going to do anything, then they would do it themselves. During the next days, David and Jacob became an investigation team. They started by interviewing neighbors again. Mrs. Lucy, the next-door neighbor, remembered that morning. Now that you mention it, yes, there was a dark blue car. It was parked near the Henderson house. They went to the Hendersons. Mrs. Henderson said something interesting. There were several days, maybe a week or two before your daughter disappeared, that I saw that same car. It would pass by the street slowly. Could you describe the car? It was big, one of those SUVs, dark blue tinted windows. They continued talking to more neighbors. 3 more mentioned seeing a similar car in the weeks prior. David compiled all the information. A dark blue SUV, tinted windows, seen multiple times in the neighborhood in the weeks before. And according to Jacob's memory, that car had been there the morning she disappeared. This wasn't random. This was surveillance. Someone had been watching Rebecca. They returned to the police station with this new information. This time Detective Sandoval took them more seriously. She promised to search databases. But David and Jacob continued on their own. David contacted the private investigator Paul Mitchell again. This changes things, Mitchell admitted. If there was prior surveillance, this wasn't random. It was targeted. We have to go through everything. Her social circle, her classmates. Did she have a boyfriend? No. At least not that we knew of. We have to talk to her friends again. They found Fernanda Ortega through Facebook. She was now 25, married, working as a psychologist. She agreed to meet with them. Fernanda, David said that we need you to think. Was there anything Rebecca mentioned to you? Fernanda looked at her coffee thoughtfully. She mentioned feeling like someone was following her, like a month before she disappeared. David leaned forward. What else? Rebecca was seeing a psychologist privately. She didn't want you to find out. Do you know the psychologist's name? Dr. Aurelio Campos. He has an office near campus. 2 days later, they were at Dr. Campos's office. I understand your situation. The doctor said that, but there's doctor-patient confidentiality. She's been missing, David said. She's been missing for 6 years. The doctor massaged the bridge of his nose. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. Rebecca was under considerable stress in the weeks prior. She mentioned feeling watched. In our last session, she was particularly agitated. She said she'd been receiving strange messages from unknown numbers, as if whoever was sending them knew her routine. This was new, completely new. That night, David pulled out Rebecca's old Nokia. He found a compatible charger. To his surprise, after a few minutes, the phone came to life. Jacob helped review the history. They scrolled back to messages from September and early October 2012. And there they were. Messages from unknown numbers. I saw you today. You were wearing your favorite blue blouse. You changed your route to campus. Interesting. Your neuropsychology professor talks too much. 3 coffees this week. You must be stressed. The messages made Jacob's skin crawl. Why didn't the police investigate this? David asked, trembling with fury. Mitchell reviewed the official file. Here it says messages were reviewed. Nothing relevant found. Either they were incompetent or they didn't want to investigate. Mitchell began the tedious process of tracking the numbers. Some were burner phones, impossible to track, but one of them was traceable. 2 weeks later, Mitchell had a name: Marcus Thompson. 32 years old at the time of disappearance, no criminal record, worked as an administrator at a logistics company. But when Mitchell dug deeper, he found something disturbing. Marcus Thompson had worked briefly as a security guard at the University of Texas at Austin 3 years before the disappearance. He was fired for reasons unspecified. "It's him," David said. "It has to be him." Mitchell did more research. He checked vehicle records. In 2012, Marcus Thompson had registered in his name a Jeep Grand Cherokee, dark blue 2008 model, tinted windows. It was the car. They returned to Detective Sandoval with concrete evidence: the harassment messages, the connection to the university, the vehicle. This time the detective listened attentively. She promised to investigate. She said they'd bring Thompson in for questioning. Marcus Thompson was brought in for questioning on November 7th, 2018. The interrogation lasted 5 hours, Detective Sandoval informed them afterward. Thompson denied everything initially. Yes, he'd sent those messages, but insisted they were harmless. He'd seen Rebecca on campus. He'd felt a connection. When he was fired from work, he'd tried to maintain contact. "And the day of her disappearance?" David asked. "That's where Thompson started getting nervous. He said he was at home, no alibi. He admitted yes, he had been in the Cedar Park neighborhood that morning, in his Jeep. Under pressure, he finally admitted something. Yes, he'd gone specifically to see her that morning. Yes, he'd planned to casually run into her, but insisted she never saw him, that he'd changed his mind and left." They verified with his employer from 2012. Records showed Thompson had clocked in to work that day, but an hour and a half late. An hour and a half. Enough time to... But without a body, without direct physical evidence, the legal case was weak. Thompson was released after questioning, but remained under surveillance. That night the family was distraught. They had the right man, they were sure. But the system needed more. Linda said something that surprised them. "He knows where she is. And we're going to make him tell us." Mitchell visited them. "I know what you're thinking. If you do something stupid, you'll ruin any legal case." "There is no legal case anymore," Linda said. "Then let's build one. Surveillance. We follow him. Eventually he'll go where the evidence is." For the next 2 weeks, Mitchell and 2 ex-colleagues followed Thompson. His routine was mundane. Home to work, work to home. Nothing suspicious until November 21st. That day, Thompson didn't go to work. Instead, he drove south of the city, almost an hour outside Austin. On the outskirts of a town called Dripping Springs, he turned onto a dirt road. Finally, they located his vehicle parked in front of an isolated property. A small country house, more like a cabin. Thompson was inside for 2 hours. When he came out, he looked agitated, nervous, repeatedly wiping his hands on his pants. Mitchell called Detective Sandoval. "We need a search warrant for this property, now." The warrant was obtained in 36 hours. On November 23rd, a team arrived at the property. Mitchell was there. So was David. They forced the padlock. They approached the cabin. The front door was closed, but not locked. They opened it. The smell hit them immediately. Humidity, mold, something chemical. Inside, the cabin was Spartan. The windows were covered with black plastic. And on the back wall of the main room, there was something that made David's heart stop. Photographs. Dozens of photographs stuck to the wall. All of Rebecca. On campus, walking the streets, entering her house. Photographs taken without her knowledge. A timeline of obsessive surveillance. And in the center was a different photograph, more recent. Rebecca, but older, her hair longer without glasses. In the photograph, she was alive. David fell to his knees. "Where is she?" he screamed. "Where is my daughter?" The investigators processed the scene. In the bathroom, they found recent feminine hygiene products. Someone had been living there. Someone had been held there. But Rebecca was no longer there. Thompson was arrested immediately. This time with concrete evidence, he couldn't get out. After hours of interrogation, he finally spoke. He admitted taking her, admitted following her that morning, forcing her into his vehicle, admitted taking her to the cabin, keeping her there for 6 years. But he insisted, with tears in his eyes, "She's alive. I didn't hurt her. I just wanted her to be with me. Where is she now?" And here Thompson said something that explained his visit days before. "She escaped 3 days ago. I went to look for her, but she was already gone." The search activated immediately. If Rebecca had escaped 3 days ago and was in the outskirts of Dripping Springs, where would she have gone? Search teams deployed. Municipal police were alerted. Media issued alerts with Rebecca's description. The family traveled to Dripping Springs. They joined the searches, shouting her name. On November 24th, a local farmer named William Harrison saw something strange. A young woman hiding in his barn among hay bales. He called authorities. The young woman was thin, emaciated, scared. But when officers arrived and asked her name, she responded with a weak but clear voice. "Rebecca Anderson. Please. I want to go home." The reunion of Rebecca with her family was broadcast on all national media. Images of Linda hugging her daughter, both crying uncontrollably. Of David holding Rebecca as if afraid she'd disappear again. Of Nathan and Jacob with tears running down their faces touched the hearts of millions of Americans. But behind that emotional reunion was a complex and painful truth. Rebecca wasn't the same 19-year-old who disappeared in 2012. She was now 25, but looked older. 6 years of captivity had left deep, invisible scars. The first days were a whirlwind. Medical exams, interviews with police, psychologists, social workers. Rebecca was physically weak, but without serious injuries. There were no signs of sexual abuse, something that surprised investigators. Thompson hadn't taken her to rape or hurt her. In his twisted mind, he really believed he loved her, that eventually she'd reciprocate his feelings if they just spent enough time together. It was a delusional fantasy he'd sustained for 6 years. Rebecca spoke with investigators, giving her testimony. She described the 6 years of captivity, the first months of absolute terror. Chained, without hope. The later years when Thompson began giving her more freedom within the cabin. He visited 2 or 3 times a week, bringing food, talking to her as if they were a normal couple. In his delusion, he seemed genuinely to believe they were building a relationship. Rebecca had learned to survive. She'd feigned, to some extent, acceptance of her situation, because resisting only led to total isolation. She'd read all the books he brought her, many of them psychology texts, ironically studying his behavior, waiting for the right moment to escape. That moment came when Thompson, becoming careless after so many years, forgot to completely close the exterior padlock. Rebecca waited until she was sure he'd left, forced the door, and ran. She ran for hours without knowing where she was going. Just away. Eventually, she found William Harrison's barn. She hid there, too terrified to reveal her presence, even when she heard the searches beginning. Marcus Thompson was sentenced to 60 years in prison for aggravated kidnapping. During the trial that took place in 2019, Thompson showed little genuine remorse. He insisted he'd taken good care of Rebecca, that he'd given her food, books, that he'd never physically hurt her. He didn't seem to understand that taking away 6 years of her life constituted incalculable damage. For the Anderson family, Having Rebecca back was both a miracle and a new set of overwhelming challenges. Rebecca struggled with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Loud sounds made her flinch. Enclosed spaces provoked panic attacks. It took weeks before she could sleep in her own room without waking up screaming. She started intensive therapy. But recovery would be a process of years, not months. The family dynamic that had been dysfunctional during the 6 years of her absence now had to completely restructure. Everyone had changed. Rebecca had lost 6 years of her life. Her parents had aged prematurely. Nathan, now 18, was practically a stranger to her. And Jacob, who was 14, was a completely different child from the little 8-year-old she remembered. But gradually, painfully, they began to rebuild. Rebecca expressed interest in resuming her psychology studies. The University of Texas at Austin, in a gesture of public support, offered to re-enroll her and cover her studies. In 2020, Rebecca returned to the classroom. It was difficult being back in the place where she'd been taken. But it was also cathartic. She completed her bachelor's degree in 2023. In her thesis, she wrote about the trauma of prolonged captivity and recovery processes. For Jacob, now 19 and studying neurobiology at university, the case's resolution brought a closure he didn't know he needed. For years, he'd carried the guilt of not having remembered earlier. His father had repeatedly assured him it wasn't his fault, that he'd been a child, that his brain processed the memory when it was ready. But the guilt persisted until he talked directly with Rebecca about it. She hugged him, her younger brother who was now taller than her, and told him, "Jacob, you saved me. Your memory brought me home. Never think you could have done more." The family participated in therapy together. David and Linda worked on rebuilding their marriage, damaged by years of pain and distancing. It wasn't easy. Some damages are permanent. But they found a new way of being together. A different relationship, but genuine. Nathan also started therapy. He'd developed trust issues due to the trauma of losing his sister during his formative years. He was studying law, inspired in part by how inadequate the justice system's response had been. He wanted to be part of the change. The case of Rebecca Anderson became one of the few missing persons cases in America with a happy ending, if such a term can be applied to such a traumatic situation. The media presented it as a story of hope, a reminder that missing people can be found alive even years later. But the family knew the full truth. Rebecca had been found not because the justice system worked properly, but despite its failure. It had been family persistence, the recovered memory of an 8-year-old child 6 years later, and a considerable amount of luck. They knew that for every case like Rebecca's, there were thousands that never resolved. Tens of thousands of American families who continued searching, waiting, crying, without answers. David got involved with organizations of families of the disappeared. He used the notoriety of the case to advocate for reforms in the justice system, for more resources to investigate disappearances, for more rigorous protocols in the critical first days. In interviews, he always ended with the same message: never stop searching, never lose hope. And to authorities, every missing person is someone's daughter. Do your job, October 11th, 2024, 12 years after the day Rebecca disappeared and 6 years after she was found. The family gathered for dinner. It was a tradition they'd established. Every year on that date, they got together to remember, to honor the path they'd traveled, to celebrate that they were together. Jacob, now a young man of 20 studying his master's degree, looked around the table. His father with more gray hair, but genuinely smiling. His mother still struggling with depression, but actively participating in support groups. Nathan in his last year of law school, talking passionately about a case. And Rebecca, 31 years old, thinner than she once was, with invisible scars, but here, alive. present. "What are you thinking about? Little Dragon?" Rebecca asked, using the old nickname. Jacob smiled. "That we're lucky, despite everything." And it was true. In a country where more than 100,000 people remained officially missing, where entire families were destroyed without any answers, where the justice system systematically failed, they had been extraordinarily lucky. Not because the system had worked, not because authorities had done their job, but because an 8-year-old child had seen something, had stored that memory in the depths of his mind. And 6 years later, when his brain was finally mature enough to process it, had brought it back to the surface. A detail so small, a fragmented memory from a traumatized child. A piece of information that in the right hands had been enough to find a young woman the world had given up for lost. This case shows us something profound about the nature of human memory. Jacob's memory, buried for 6 years, emerged exactly when his brain was ready to process it. Neuroscientists tell us this isn't unusual. A child's brain protects traumatic information until it's ready to face it. But it also shows us the systematic failures of our institutions. If police had properly investigated from the beginning, if they'd tracked those disturbing messages, if they'd taken surveillance reports seriously, Rebecca might have been found years earlier. For the thousands of families still searching for their missing loved ones, this case offers both hope and frustration. Hope because it demonstrates that even years later, people can be found. Frustration because it underscores how inadequate the system is that should protect us. If this story impacted you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave your like and share with someone who's also interested in real cases. Tell us in the comments what you think about how Jacob's memory held that crucial detail for 6 years. And remember, behind every disappearance statistic is a destroyed family waiting for answers. It's never too late to search for the truth. Thank you for watching this story of pain, hope, and the extraordinary power of human memory. See you in the next case.